The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone square as merchants hurried to set up their stalls. The usual bustle of market day filled the air with voices haggling over prices and children playing between the wooden carts. But today was different. Today, the town square would witness something that would change everything for those who saw it. Elena Vasilyev kept her head down as the guards pushed her forward. Her wrists were bound with rough rope that cut into her skin with every step. The crowd gathered quickly, drawn by the spectacle of a public punishment. Some faces showed curiosity, others disgust, and a few revealed the hungry look of those who enjoyed watching others suffer. She had been caught 3 days ago, trying to steal medical supplies from the army depot. The war had been raging for 2 years, and civilian doctors were desperate for anything to help the wounded flooding into the city. Elena worked as a nurse in the makeshift hospital that had been set up in the old cathedral. Every day, she watched good people die from infections that could have been prevented with proper supplies. The decision to steal had not been easy. Elena came from a respectable family. Her father had been a professor at the university before the war started. Her mother had taught piano to the children of wealthy families. But war changed everything. Her parents were killed in the first bombing of the city. The university was turned into barracks. The wealthy families had fled to safer places, taking their money and their piano lessons with them. General Marcus Corvus stood on the platform that had been erected for the occasion. He was a tall man with gray hair and scars on his face that spoke of many battles. His uniform was perfectly pressed, every metal polished to a bright shine. The general had a reputation for being strict but fair. His soldiers respected him because he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. The crowd grew larger as word spread through the narrow streets. Women pulled their children closer as they recognized the severity of what was about to happen. Men removed their caps in awkward silence. The punishment for stealing military supplies during wartime was severe. The law was clear, and General Corvus always followed the law. Elena forced herself to stand straight despite her fear. She would not give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her break down. She had known the risks when she took those supplies. The antibiotics and bandages she had managed to take had saved 3 lives before she was caught. If she had to pay the ultimate price for those 3 lives, she would do it with whatever dignity she could manage. The town crier stepped forward and unrolled scroll. His voice carried across the square as he read the charges. Theft of military property during wartime. Treason against the state. Conspiracy to aid the enemy. The last charge made Elena angry. She had never aided the enemy. Every person she had helped was a citizen of her own country, wounded in the defense of their homeland. General Corvus raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried an edge of authority that made everyone listen. He explained that discipline was essential during wartime, that laws existed to protect everyone, not just the few, that exceptions could not be made, no matter how noble the intentions might seem. Elena listened to his words and found herself thinking about the children she had helped save. Little Anna, whose leg had been crushed by falling debris. Without the antibiotics Elena had stolen, the infection would have killed her. Now Anna was walking again, playing with her friends in the refugee camp outside the city. Then there was old Mr. Petrov, who had been shot while defending his shop from looters. The bandages had stopped his bleeding until a proper surgeon could be found. The third person was a young soldier, barely 18 years old. He had been brought to the cathedral hospital with a wound that was turning green with infection. The military doctors had written him off as lost, but Elena had used the stolen medicine to save his life. She wondered if that soldier would be in the crowd today, watching her punishment. She hoped he would understand why she had done what she did. A wooden post had been erected in the center of the platform. Iron rings were attached to it at shoulder height. Elena knew what they were for. She had heard stories of other public punishments, other people who had been made examples of. The shame of being stripped before the crowd was considered part of the justice. It broke people's spirits as much as any physical pain. The guards began to push Elena toward the post. Each step felt like walking through deep mud. Her legs wanted to give out beneath her, but she forced them to keep moving. The crowd pressed closer, their faces becoming clearer as she approached the platform. She saw familiar faces from the neighborhood where she had grown up. Mrs. Kowalski from the bakery, young Tom from the blacksmith shop, people who had known her family, who had watched her grow up. Some of those familiar faces showed sympathy in their eyes. Others looked away, unable to watch what was about to happen to someone they had known as a child. A few seemed to enjoy the spectacle, as if her punishment somehow made them feel better about their own struggles. General Corvus nodded to his aide, who stepped forward with another scroll. This one contained the details of the punishment. Elena would be stripped and whipped 30 times as an example to others who might be tempted to steal from military supplies. The general's voice remained steady as he read the sentence, but Elena thought she detected something in his eyes that had not been there before. Was it doubt? Regret? She could not be sure. The crowd fell silent as 2 guards approached Elena. Their job was to prepare her for the punishment. She closed her eyes and tried to think of something else, anything else. She remembered her mother's piano lessons, the sound of music filling their small apartment on Sunday afternoons. She remembered her father's books, the smell of old paper, and ink that always clung to his clothes. The guards cut the rope binding her wrists, but only so they could secure her arms to the iron rings. Elena felt the cold metal against her skin as they locked the shackles in place. Even the children stopped their crying. Elena felt hands at her back, pulling at her clothes. The rough fabric of her prison shirt was torn away, exposing her bare skin to the cold morning air and the hungry eyes of the crowd. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. She would not give them that satisfaction. But as the executioner prepared to deliver the first blow, something happened that no one expected. General Corvus stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Elena's back with an expression of complete shock. His face had gone white, and his hand moved to his throat as if he could not breathe. The crowd sensed something was wrong. The murmuring began quietly, but grew louder as people tried to understand why the general had stopped the proceedings. The executioner lowered his whip and looked around in confusion. Elena could not see what had caused the general's reaction, but she felt the change in the atmosphere around her. The tension that had been building toward the moment of her punishment suddenly shifted into something else entirely. She turned her head as much as the shackles would allow, trying to see the general's face. General Corvus took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Elena's back. His aide moved closer, concerned by the general's strange behavior. The crowd pressed forward, trying to get a better view of whatever had captured the general's attention. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharper shadows across the platform. The market stalls remained abandoned as everyone focused on the drama unfolding before them. Vendors forgot their goods. Children stopped their games. Even the guards seemed uncertain about what they should do. Elena felt exposed and vulnerable, not just from her physical state, but from the way everyone was staring at her. She could not understand what had happened to change everything so suddenly. One moment, she had been preparing herself for the worst pain of her life. The next moment, the entire square had fallen into confused silence. The general's aide whispered something in his ear, but General Corvus waved him away without taking his eyes off Elena's back. His breathing was quick and shallow, as if he had just run a great distance. His hands shook slightly as he pointed at something the crowd could not see. Elena closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming next. She had accepted that she would be punished for her crime. She had made peace with the pain and the shame that would follow. But this strange interruption had thrown everything into chaos. She did not know if that would make things better or worse for her. The crowd began to grow restless. They had come to witness a punishment, and now they were being made to wait without explanation. Some people began to leave, disappointed that the show was not proceeding as expected. Others pushed forward, trying to get close enough to see what had caught the general's attention. The executioner stood with his whip at his side, unsure whether he should continue or wait for new orders. The guards looked to their officers for guidance, but even the officers seemed confused by the general's behavior. The entire military structure that had seemed so certain and powerful just moments before now appeared uncertain and fragile. Elena heard whispers from the crowd, fragments of conversation that reached her ears despite the chaos. People were speculating about what they had seen on her back. Some thought it might be a birthmark. Others suggested it could be a tattoo with special meaning. A few wondered if she might be someone important, someone whose identity had been hidden until this moment. The sun continued to climb, and the shadows continued to shift. Elena's arms ached from being stretched above her head, but she forced herself to remain still. Whatever was happening around her was bigger than her own discomfort. The look in General Corvus's eyes suggested that her fate had just taken a turn that no one could have predicted. The general finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. He spoke a single word, but it was spoken with such intensity that it seemed to echo across the entire square. That word would change everything for Elena, for the general, and for everyone who witnessed what happened next. As the morning sun reached its peak, casting everything in harsh, bright light, the crowd waited to learn what mark on Elena's back had the power to freeze a general in his tracks and turn a routine punishment into something that would be remembered for generations to come. The word that General Corvus whispered was a name. Katerina. It hung in the air like a prayer or a curse, depending on who heard it. The crowd strained to catch the meaning behind that single word, but only the general understood its true significance. Elena felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. No one had called her by her real name in over 2 years. Not since she had been forced to take on false papers and a new identity to survive in a war-torn city. Elena Vasilyev was the name on her forged documents. But Katerina Volkov was who she really was, and General Corvus was the only person left alive who knew that name. 25 years earlier, Marcus Corvus had not been a general. He had been a young lieutenant, fresh out of military academy, assigned to guard duty at the royal palace. The kingdom had been at peace then, and palace guard duty was considered an easy posting for new officers. Marcus had been grateful for the assignment. It allowed him to learn his duties without the pressure of actual combat. The royal family had been larger in those days. King Vladimir ruled with wisdom and strength, but he was getting older. His eldest son, Prince Alexander, was being groomed to take the throne. The younger children were free to pursue their own interests, knowing that the burden of rulership would never fall on their shoulders. Princess Katerina had been 8 years old when Lieutenant Corvus first met her. She was a serious child who spent more time reading books than playing with dolls. Her tutors praised her intelligence, but worried about her lack of friends among the other noble children. She preferred the company of the palace staff to that of visiting princes and princesses who came for formal dinners and political meetings. Marcus remembered the first conversation he had with the young princess. She had found him standing guard outside the library and asked him why he looked so bored. When he explained that guard duty required him to stand still and watch for danger that never came, she had laughed and told him that sounded like the worst job in the world. From that day forward, Princess Katerina made it her mission to entertain the young guards during their boring shifts. She would bring them books to read when no one was watching. She would share stories about the interesting things she learned from her tutors. Sometimes she would bring them treats from the kitchen, smuggled past the stern head cook who did not approve of princesses consorting with common soldiers. The other guards enjoyed the princess's attention, but Marcus found himself looking forward to her visits more than he should have. She was intelligent and curious about the world beyond the palace walls. She asked him about his life before joining the army, about his family, and his dreams for the future. No noble had ever shown such interest in his personal story. As Princess Katerina grew older, their conversations became deeper and more meaningful. She confided in Marcus about her fears for the kingdom. The neighboring countries were growing more aggressive in their territorial demands. Her father was getting weaker, and her brother Alexander seemed more interested in parties than in learning how to rule wisely. Marcus had been promoted several times during his years at the palace. By the time Princess Katerina turned 16, He was a captain responsible for her personal security. This meant spending even more time in her company, traveling with her when she visited other parts of the kingdom and attending formal events where she needed protection. The bond between them had grown stronger over the years, but both understood that it could never be more than friendship. She was a princess, destined to marry for political advantage. He was a soldier, useful for protection, but never suitable for marriage. They never spoke about the feelings that had developed between them, but both knew they existed. The mark on Princess Katerina's back had been her most carefully guarded secret. When she was born, the royal physician had discovered a birthmark in the shape of a crescent moon just below her right shoulder blade. The court astrologer had declared it a sign of great destiny, but the king had ordered it kept secret. Political enemies could use such information against the royal family, claiming the mark was evidence of divine displeasure or demonic influence. Only a handful of people knew about the birthmark: the king and queen, the royal physician, the head nursemaid who had cared for Katerina as a baby, and Marcus. He had learned about it by accident during an assassination attempt when the princess was 17. A poison blade had torn her dress, and Marcus had seen the mark while helping to treat her wounds. The princess had made him swear never to tell anyone about the birthmark. She trusted him completely, and that trust had meant everything to Marcus. In a palace full of political intrigue and shifting loyalties, their friendship was the one relationship based on genuine care rather than personal gain. Everything had changed when the current war began. Enemy forces had attacked without warning, overwhelming the border defenses before anyone could react. The capital city had fallen within days. King Vladimir and Prince Alexander had been killed defending the palace. The queen and the younger children had disappeared, presumably captured or killed in the chaos. Marcus had been away from the capital when the attack came, leading a patrol along the northern border. By the time he and his men fought their way back to the city, it was too late to save the royal family. The palace was in ruins, and the new government had declared all surviving members of the royal family to be enemies of the state. For 2 years, Marcus had believed that Princess Katerina was dead. He had searched through the refugees who fled the fallen capital, hoping to find some trace of her. He had questioned prisoners and deserters, looking for any information about what had happened to the surviving members of the royal family. Every lead had ended in disappointment. The guilt had eaten at him during those 2 years. As her personal guard, it had been his duty to protect the princess. He had failed in that duty, and the failure haunted his dreams. He threw himself into his military service, earning promotion after promotion through his fierce dedication to his new cause. Fighting against the enemy became his way of honoring the memory of the royal family he had failed to protect. Now, standing on the platform in the town square, General Corvus stared at the crescent-shaped birthmark he had hoped never to see again. Princess Katerina was alive. She had survived the fall of the capital somehow and had been living under a false identity in this war-torn city. But she was no longer the protected princess he had known. She was a fugitive facing a death sentence for crimes committed in the name of survival. The crowd grew more restless as the general continued to stare without explanation. His aide, Colonel Petrov, stepped closer and spoke in a low voice that only the general could hear. "Sir, the men are waiting for orders. Should we proceed with the punishment?" General Corvus did not answer immediately. His mind was racing through the implications of what he had discovered. If he revealed Princess Katerina's true identity, it might save her life. But it would also expose her to even greater danger. The current government had put bounties on the heads of all surviving royal family members. Every enemy agent and bounty hunter in the country would come hunting for her. If he proceeded with the punishment as planned, he would be ordering the torture of the woman he had sworn to protect with his life. But stopping the punishment without explanation would raise questions he was not prepared to answer. His own position was precarious enough without having his loyalty questioned by his superiors. Elena could not see the general's face, but she could feel his internal struggle radiating across the platform like heat from a fire. She remembered their last conversation, the night before the capital fell. Marcus had been preparing to leave on what both of them knew might be a final patrol. The enemy was closing in, and everyone could feel that something terrible was about to happen. They had met in the palace garden, away from the ears of servants and courtiers. The moon had been full that night, casting silver light on the flowers that would be trampled by enemy boots within a week. Princess Katerina had given Marcus a small silver locket containing a miniature portrait of herself. It was not an appropriate gift for a princess to give to a guard, but appropriateness seemed less important with death approaching. Marcus had refused the locket at first, knowing that accepting it would be dangerous for both of them. But the princess had insisted, saying that she wanted him to have something to remember her by if the worst happened. He had finally accepted the gift, tucking it inside his uniform where it would remain close to his heart. Elena wondered if Marcus still carried that locket. She wondered if he had grieved for her when the palace fell. Most of all, she wondered what he would do now that he knew she was alive. The Marcus she remembered had been a man of honor who always tried to do the right thing. But war changed people in ways that could not be predicted. The executioner shifted his weight impatiently, the whip heavy in his hands. He had performed many public punishments, and he understood the importance of maintaining momentum. Delays made the crowd restless and gave prisoners time to gather courage for resistance. But he could not proceed without direct orders from the general. Elena tested the strength of the shackles holding her arms above her head. The iron was solid and well-made. There would be no breaking free, even if she had somewhere to run. The platform was surrounded by armed guards, and beyond them stretched a crowd that would be eager to capture a fleeing prisoner. Escape was impossible, but Elena had not survived 2 years as a fugitive by accepting impossible situations. General Corvus finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Release the prisoner." The words were simple, but they fell on the crowd like a thunderbolt. Murmurs of confusion and anger rippled through the gathered people. They had come to see justice done, and now they were being denied their spectacle. Colonel Petrov stepped forward, clearly confused by the order. "Sir, the prisoner has been sentenced according to military law. The charges have been proven beyond doubt." The general turned to face his aide, and Elena saw something in his eyes that had not been there before. It was determination mixed with something that might have been desperation. "I said release the prisoner, Colonel." Immediately, the guards looked to their colonel for confirmation. Military discipline required them to follow orders from their superior officers, but the situation had become unclear. Was the general acting within his authority, or had something compromised his judgment? Colonel Petrov hesitated for a moment, then nodded to the guards. Elena felt the shackles being unlocked from her wrists. Blood rushed back into her arms as she lowered them for the first time in hours. Someone draped a rough blanket around her shoulders, covering her exposed skin. She turned to face General Corvus, and their eyes met for the first time in over 2 years. The connection between them was immediate and powerful. Despite everything that had changed, despite the war and the lost years and the false identities, they recognized each other completely. Elena saw the boy she had known in the man's scarred face. Marcus saw the woman the little princess had become in the prisoner's defiant stance. The crowd was becoming angry now. They had been promised justice, and justice was being denied without explanation. Someone shouted a question about why the thief was being freed. Others demanded to know what authority the general had to overturn a legal sentence. The murmuring grew louder and more hostile. General Corvus raised his hand for silence, but this time the crowd was reluctant to obey. Their bloodlust had been aroused, and they were not satisfied with being sent home without seeing punishment delivered. A few rocks were thrown, though they fell short of the platform. The guards moved closer together, preparing for the possibility that the crowd might rush the stage. Elena looked out at the sea of angry faces and realized that her danger had not ended with her release from the shackles. The crowd wanted blood, and they were not particular about whose blood they spilled. If General Corvus could not control them, she might be torn apart by the mob before she could escape. The general seemed to realize the same thing. He stepped forward to the edge of the platform and spoke in the commanding voice that had led men through countless battles. "Citizens, this prisoner is now under my personal custody. Any person who interferes with my orders will be arrested and charged with treason against the state." The threat worked, but barely. The crowd remained hostile, but they were not willing to challenge the general's authority directly. Elena could see that the situation remained dangerous. One spark could turn the crowd into a mob that would overwhelm even the armed guards. General Corvus turned back to Elena and spoke in a voice only she could hear. "Can you walk?" When she nodded, he continued, "Stay close to me. We need to get you away from here before this gets out of hand." Elena pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and prepared to follow the man who had once sworn to protect her with his life. She did not know what would happen next, but for the first time in 2 years, she was not facing her troubles alone. Marcus was alive, and somehow that made everything else seem possible to overcome. As they prepared to leave the platform together, Elena caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. It was the young soldier whose life she had saved with the stolen medical supplies. He was watching her with a mixture of confusion and gratitude, clearly not understanding what was happening, but recognizing her as the nurse who had helped him. That sight reminded Elena of why she had committed the crime that brought her to this moment. She had acted to save lives, and she would make the same choice again if necessary. Whatever happened next, she could face it knowing that her actions had been guided by compassion rather than greed or malice. The general's aide organized a formation of guards to escort them from the platform. Elena walked in the center of the group, protected on all sides by armed soldiers. As they moved through the hostile crowd, she kept her eyes forward and tried not to think about what might have happened if Marcus had not recognized the mark on her back. Behind them, the crowd slowly began to disperse, disappointed but not quite ready to challenge the general's authority. The town square returned to its normal bustle of market day, but everyone who had been there would remember what they had witnessed. The story would spread quickly through the city and beyond, becoming legend long before anyone understood its true meaning. General Corvus walked beside Elena in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The morning sun had given way to afternoon heat, and the shadows were growing shorter as they made their way through the narrow streets toward whatever sanctuary the general had in mind. Neither of them spoke during the journey, but both were acutely aware of the other's presence after 2 years of believing they would never meet again. The war had taken everything else from them, but somehow it had also brought them back together. Whether that reunion would prove to be a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. The safe house was located in the old merchant district, tucked between a shuttered bookstore and an abandoned jewelry shop. General Corvus led Elena through a series of narrow alleys and side streets, taking a route that would confuse anyone trying to follow them. The guards maintained their protective formation until they reached the unmarked door that led to temporary sanctuary. Inside, the building was sparse but clean. The windows had been covered with heavy curtains that blocked out most of the afternoon light. A few pieces of simple furniture filled the main room: a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. It was the kind of place that could be abandoned quickly if discovery became imminent. The rough blanket still covered her shoulders, and she pulled it tighter as the reality of her situation began to sink in. General Corvus dismissed the guards with orders to patrol the surrounding streets, but maintained distance from the safe house itself. Too much obvious security would attract the wrong kind of attention. When the last soldier had left, Marcus finally allowed his military composure to crack. He sat heavily in the remaining chair and buried his face in his hands. The silence stretched between them for several minutes. Neither knew how to begin a conversation that needed to bridge 2 years of separation, a war that had destroyed everything they once knew, and the impossible circumstances of their reunion. Elena studied Marcus's face, noting the new lines around his eyes and the gray that now streaked his dark hair. War had aged him far beyond the passage of time. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice rough with emotion he had kept bottled up for too long. I thought you were dead. I searched for months after the capital fell. I questioned every refugee, every prisoner, every survivor who made it out of the city. No one had seen you. No one knew what happened to any of the royal family after the palace was overrun. Elena nodded slowly, understanding the pain that had driven his search. I barely escaped myself. There was a servant's tunnel that led from my chambers to the kitchen cellars. My governess knew about it from her days working in the palace as a young woman. She pushed me into that tunnel just as the enemy soldiers reached our floor. The memory was still painful even after 2 years. Elena could recall every detail of that night with terrible clarity. The sound of gunfire in the corridors, the smell of smoke as parts of the palace burned, the screams of servants, and guards being cut down by the advancing enemy forces. Her governess, Mrs. Peterson, had sacrificed her own chance of escape to ensure that the princess made it to safety. The tunnel led to the old wine cellars beneath the merchant district, Elena continued. I hid there for 3 days before I dared to come out. By then, the city had been completely occupied. The new government had posted bounties for any surviving members of the royal family, dead or alive, but preferably dead. Marcus listened without interruption, trying to imagine the frightened 17-year-old princess hiding alone in dark cellars while her world collapsed around her. The Katerina he remembered had been sheltered and protected, surrounded by people whose job it was to ensure her safety and comfort. Transforming herself into a streetwise survivor named Elena must have required enormous strength and adaptability. I managed to contact one of the underground networks that helped people escape the city, Elena said. They provided me with false papers and taught me how to blend in with the civilian population. The name Elena Vasiliev belonged to a nurse who had been killed in the first bombing. Taking her identity gave me a way to survive and a purpose that felt meaningful. The irony was not lost on either of them. Princess Katerina had become a nurse in order to save lives, and that same desire to help others had led to her arrest for stealing medical supplies. The compassion that had always defined her character had remained constant even as everything else in her life changed beyond recognition. Marcus reached inside his uniform jacket and pulled out a small object that gleamed silver in the dim light. It was the locket that Elena had given him on that last night at the palace. He sat on the table between them, and Elena gasped with recognition. She had forgotten about the gift in all the chaos that followed, but seeing it now brought back every emotion from that final evening. I have carried this every day since he gave it to me, Marcus said quietly. During the worst battles, when I thought I might not survive the night, I would hold it and remember what I was fighting for. Even after I believed you were dead, I could not bring myself to put it away. Elena reached across the table and picked up the locket with trembling fingers. The silver was warm for being carried close to Marcus's heart, and the tiny clasp still opened smoothly despite 2 years of constant handling. Inside was the miniature portrait she remembered commissioning from the court artist. It showed her, at 17, dressed in the formal gown she had worn for her coming-of-age ceremony. Looking at that portrait now felt like looking at a different person entirely. The girl in the painting had soft hands and perfect hair and eyes that had never seen real suffering. Elena's hands were now calloused from work in the hospital. Her hair was roughly cut and often dirty. Her eyes had seen things that the princess in the portrait could never have imagined. "You have changed," Marcus observed, though his tone suggested that the changes were not necessarily bad ones. "You are stronger now, more confident." The princess I knew was kind and intelligent, but she had never been tested by real hardship. The woman sitting here has proven herself in ways that matter. Elena set the locket back on the table, but she did not push it away. The princess you knew was weak and useless. She had never worked a day in her life or faced any real problems. These 2 years have been horrible in many ways, but they have also taught me things I could never have learned in the palace. I know how to take care of myself now. I know what really matters and what is just meaningless luxury. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the past and the present. The afternoon light, filtering through the heavy curtains, grew dimmer as evening approached. Outside, the sounds of the city continued. Merchants closing their shops, children playing in the streets, horses and carriages moving through the cobblestone roads. Life went on as normal for most people, even as Elena and Marcus grappled with the impossibility of their situation. The practical problems began to assert themselves as the emotional reunion faded into the background. Elena was still a wanted criminal, regardless of her true identity. Marcus had used his authority to free her from immediate punishment, but questions would be asked about his decision. His superiors would expect explanations that he could not provide without exposing them both to greater danger. "What happens now?" Elena asked, voicing the concern that had been growing in both their minds. "You cannot hide me forever. People will start asking questions about why you freed a convicted thief, and if anyone discovers who I really am." Marcus had been thinking about the same problems during their walk to the safe house. His position as a general gave him significant authority, but it was not unlimited. The military hierarchy demanded accountability, especially for decisions that appeared to contradict established law and policy. He would need to provide explanations soon, and those explanations would need to be convincing enough to satisfy his superiors. "I've been developing a plan," Marcus said carefully. "There is a resistance network operating in this region. They help people escape to neutral territories where the war has not yet reached. If we can make contact with them, they might be able to get you across the border to safety." Elena shook her head immediately. "I cannot run away again. I've spent 2 years hiding from who I really am. I have work here that matters. People depend on me at the hospital. I cannot just abandon them because my past has caught up with me." The determination in her voice reminded Marcus of the stubborn little princess who had once insisted on visiting the injured guards despite her tutor's objections. Elena had always been willing to help others, even when it put her at personal risk. That fundamental aspect of her character had not changed, even though everything else in her life had been transformed by war and hardship. "The resistance might offer more than just escape routes," Marcus said. "There are people working to overthrow the current government and restore legitimate leadership to the country. Your survival could be important to their cause. The royal family still has supporters who have been waiting for a reason to hope." The suggestion hung between them like a dangerous temptation. Elena had never thought of herself as a political leader. She had been the youngest daughter of the royal family, expected to marry well and support her brother's rule from the background. But her brother was dead, along with her parents and most of the other potential heirs to the throne. "I do not want to be a symbol," Elena said firmly. "I have seen what happens to symbols in wartime. They get people killed for abstract ideals while real problems go unsolved. I would rather be a nurse who saves actual lives than a princess who inspires people to die for a lost cause." Marcus understood her reluctance, but he also saw the larger picture that Elena might be avoiding. The current government had seized power through violence and maintained control through fear and oppression. The people suffered under policies designed to benefit the occupying forces rather than the native population. A legitimate alternative to that government could give hope to millions of people who had lost everything. What if restoring legitimate government is not a lost cause? Marcus asked gently, "What if there's a real chance to end this war and bring peace back to the kingdom? Would you be willing to consider playing a role in that effort?" Elena was quiet for a long time, weighing the implications of what Marcus was suggesting. She had spent 2 years focused on immediate, practical problems, finding food, avoiding arrest, helping injured people recover from their wounds. The larger questions of politics and governance had seemed abstract and irrelevant to her daily struggle for survival. But she could not deny that the work she had been doing was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. No matter how many individuals she helped, the war continued to create new casualties every day. The root cause of the suffering was the conflict itself, and that conflict would only end when political solutions replaced military ones. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Marcus immediately moved to a position where he could see the entrance while remaining hidden from anyone outside. Elena pulled the blanket closer around herself and prepared to move quickly if necessary. 2 years of living as a fugitive had taught her to always be ready to run at a moment's notice. Marcus recognized the knock pattern as one used by his trusted contacts in the military intelligence network. He opened the door carefully, revealing a young soldier who looked nervous about being seen in this part of the city after dark. The soldier handed Marcus a sealed envelope and departed immediately without speaking. The message inside was brief but alarming. Marcus's superiors had noticed his unusual behavior during the public punishment. Questions were being asked about his decision to free the prisoner and his subsequent disappearance from his assigned duties. A formal inquiry had been scheduled for the following morning, and Marcus was ordered to report for questioning. Elena saw the concern in Marcus's face as he read the message. "What is it? What has happened?" Marcus handed her the letter, and Elena read it quickly. The implications were clear enough. Marcus had risked his career and possibly his life to save her, and now that risk was becoming a reality. If he could not provide satisfactory answers to his superior's questions, he would face charges of misconduct or worse. "You have to turn me in," Elena said quietly. "It is the only way to protect yourself. Tell them that you recognize me as someone with useful information about the resistance networks. Say that you freed me to interrogate me privately before turning me over to intelligence officers." Marcus shook his head firmly. "I will not betray you. Not after everything we have been through, and not after I've just found you again." The loyalty in his voice touched Elena deeply, but it also frightened her. She had learned to survive by being practical rather than sentimental. Emotional decisions in wartime usually led to tragedy for everyone involved. Marcus was risking everything for her, and she could not allow him to destroy himself for her sake. "Then, we need to find another solution," Elena said. "One that protects both of us and gives us a chance to do something meaningful with our lives. You mentioned a resistance network. How quickly can you make contact with them?" Marcus considered the question carefully. He had been developing connections with various resistance groups as part of his intelligence-gathering duties. Some of those connections might be willing to help, especially if they understood what Elena's survival could mean for their cause. But reaching out to them would be dangerous and would require careful planning. "I can send a message tonight," Marcus said. "There is someone I trust who can act as an intermediary. But we would need to be prepared to move quickly once contact is made. The resistance does not stay in one place for long, and opportunities to connect with them are rare." Elena nodded, understanding that they were crossing a line that would change everything for both of them. Once they committed to working with the resistance, there would be no going back to their previous lives. Marcus would be giving up his military career and his position in the established government. Elena would be abandoning her carefully constructed false identity and accepting the dangerous role of a royal claimant. But the alternative was to continue hiding and running while the war consumed everything they cared about. At least working with the resistance offered a chance to fight back against the forces that had destroyed their world. It was dangerous and uncertain, but it was also hopeful in a way that mere survival could never be. As night fell outside the safe house, Elena and Marcus began to plan their next moves. The locket sat between them on the table, a symbol of their shared past and a reminder of what they were fighting to restore. Tomorrow would bring new dangers and difficult choices, but for the first time in 2 years, they would face those challenges together. The princess was dead, and the general's career was ending. But from those endings, something new was being born. A partnership between two people who had learned that survival was not enough when justice remained beyond reach. They had found each other again, and now they would discover whether their love could survive the test of revolution. The resistance contact arrived before dawn, moving through the empty streets like a shadow with purpose. Elena heard the soft footsteps approach the safe house and felt her muscles tense automatically. 2 years of living as a fugitive had trained her body to react to unexpected sounds with immediate alertness, even when her mind was still foggy with sleep. Marcus was already awake, having spent most of the night planning their next moves. He had written coded messages to 3 different resistance contacts, hoping that at least one of them would be able to help. The messages had been carried by trusted couriers who knew how to move through the city without attracting attention from the military patrols. The knock came in a pattern of 3 short taps, followed by 2 longer ones. Marcus recognized the signal and opened the door to reveal a woman in her 40s wearing the rough clothes of a factory worker. Her name was Anna Kozlov, and she had been passing information to the resistance for over a year while maintaining her cover as a supervisor in a textile mill. Anna entered the safe house quickly and surveyed Elena with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She had been told that Marcus needed help with extracting a valuable prisoner, but she had not been given any details about the prisoner's identity. The sight of a young woman wrapped in a blanket and sitting at a simple wooden table was not what she had expected. "This is the valuable prisoner?" Anna asked, making no attempt to hide her skepticism. "She looks like half the nurses in the city. What makes her worth risking a general's career?" Marcus exchanged glances with Elena before answering. They had discussed how much to reveal to the resistance contacts, knowing that too much information could be dangerous, but too little might prevent them from getting the help they needed. Elena nodded slightly, giving Marcus permission to share what was necessary. "Her real name is Princess Katerina," Marcus said quietly. "She is the last surviving member of the royal family." Anna's reaction was immediate and intense. She took a step backward and stared at Elena with a mixture of disbelief and awe. Like most people in the resistance, Anna had assumed that all the royals had been killed when the capital fell. The possibility that one had survived and was sitting in front of her was overwhelming. "Prove it," Anna said after a moment of stunned silence. "Anyone can claim to be a lost princess. The resistance cannot afford to be deceived by someone seeking attention or trying to infiltrate our networks." Elena understood the woman's caution. She stood up and allowed the blanket to fall away from her shoulders, revealing the simple dress that the guards had given her to replace her torn prison clothing. Without speaking, she turned around and lifted the back of the dress to expose the crescent-shaped birthmark below her right shoulder blade. Anna gasped and fell to one knee in an instinctive gesture of respect. She had heard stories about the royal birthmark from older resistance members who had worked in the palace before the war. Seeing it in person was proof that could not be faked or disputed. Princess Katerina was indeed alive, and she was asking for the resistance's help. "Your Highness," Anna began, but Elena cut her off with a sharp gesture. "My name is Elena," she said firmly. "The princess died when the palace fell. I am a nurse who has been trying to help people survive this war. That is who I choose to be, with or without the resistance's assistance." Anna looked confused by Elena's rejection of her royal title, but Marcus understood. Elena had spent 2 years building a new identity based on her actions rather than her bloodline. She was not interested in trading that hard-won independence for the symbolic role of a powerless figurehead. The 3 of them sat around a small table as Anna explained what the resistance could offer. There were safe houses throughout the region, connected by a network of trusted couriers and sympathetic civilians. They could provide new identities, travel documents, and eventually passage to neutral countries where Elena could live in safety. But Anna also described a more dangerous alternative. The resistance had been planning a major operation designed to destabilize the occupying government and inspire a general uprising. They had been waiting for the right catalyst, something that could unite the scattered opposition groups and give them a common cause to rally around. Princess Katerina's survival could be exactly what they needed. Elena listened to the proposal with growing unease. The resistance wanted to reveal her identity publicly and use her as a symbol to mobilize popular support for their cause. They envisioned proclamations and speeches, public appearances designed to prove that legitimate authority still existed and could be restored. It was exactly the kind of symbolic role that Elena had rejected when discussing the matter with Marcus. What would this operation actually accomplish? Elena asked bluntly. Would it end the war sooner, or would it just prolong the fighting by giving people false hope? Anna was clearly not accustomed to having her proposals questioned so directly, especially by someone she considered royalty. But she answered honestly, acknowledging that the resistance's chances of success were uncertain. Military victory against the occupying forces would be difficult to achieve without support from outside allies who had been reluctant to become involved in the conflict. Marcus had been quiet during most of this conversation, but now he spoke up with a concern that had been growing in his mind. There is another problem that we need to address immediately. I am ordered to report for questioning this morning about my decision to free Elena. If I do not appear, I will be declared a deserter and hunted down. If I do appear and cannot provide satisfactory answers, I will be arrested. The reminder of Marcus's immediate danger refocused everyone's attention on the practical problems they faced. Elena realized that her desire to avoid political roles was less important than ensuring Marcus's safety. He had risked everything to save her, and she could not allow him to be destroyed by the consequences of that choice. What if Marcus reported that I died during an escape attempt? Elena suggested. He could claim that he was interrogating me when I attacked him and tried to flee. He was forced to kill me in self-defense, and my body was lost in the river when I fell during the struggle. Anna shook her head immediately. Too many people saw you leave the platform alive and under guard. That story would not be believed, especially by intelligence officers who were trained to detect deception. Marcus agreed with Anna's assessment. His superiors were suspicious precisely because his behavior had been so unusual. Any explanation that seemed too convenient would only increase their doubts about his loyalty and judgment. They needed a solution that would satisfy the military hierarchy while protecting both Elena and Marcus from further investigation. There might be another way, Anna said slowly, clearly thinking through a complicated plan as she spoke. The resistance has been planning to feed false information to the military intelligence network. We could arrange for Marcus to discover this false information in a way that makes him look like an effective officer rather than a traitor. The plan that Anna outlined was risky, but potentially effective. Marcus would report for his questioning as ordered, but he would bring with him intelligence that appeared to expose a significant resistance operation. This intelligence would actually be false information designed to misdirect military resources away from real resistance activities. But it would be convincing enough to explain why Marcus had acted unusually the day before. Elena would be reported as a resistance contact who had provided this intelligence in exchange for her freedom. Marcus could claim that he had recognized her potential value as an informant and had taken personal control of her interrogation to prevent other officers from interfering. When the intelligence proved valuable, his unconventional methods would be seen as brilliant rather than suspicious. The plan required careful coordination and perfect timing. Anna would need to provide Marcus with detailed false information that would stand up to expert analysis, at least long enough for him to establish his credibility with his superiors. Elena would need to disappear completely, leaving no trace that could contradict Marcus's story or lead investigators to the real resistance networks. Elena felt uncomfortable with the deception involved, but she understood that wartime survival often required morally ambiguous choices. Marcus had already compromised his principles by freeing her without authorization. Now they needed to protect him from the consequences of that choice, even if it meant lying to his superiors and potentially endangering resistance operations. As morning approached, they finalized the details of their plan. Anna provided Marcus with documents and intelligence reports that had been carefully crafted to appear authentic, while containing subtle flaws that would eventually expose them as forgeries. By the time the deception was discovered, Marcus would hopefully be in a position to claim that he had been deceived along with everyone else. Elena gathered her few possessions and prepared to leave the safe house forever. She would be taken to a resistance hideout in the mountains outside the city, where she could begin training for whatever role she eventually chose to play in the opposition movement. Whether that role would be symbolic or practical remained to be decided, but At least she would have time to make the choice without immediate pressure. Marcus put on his military uniform and prepared to return to his duties as if nothing unusual had happened. He would attend the questioning session and present his false intelligence with complete conviction. Success would require him to lie convincingly to people who had trusted him for years, but failure would mean death or imprisonment for both Elena and himself. Before they separated, Marcus and Elena shared a private moment away from Anna's watchful eyes. They both understood that this might be the last time they would see each other for a long time, if ever. The resistance operated in secrecy, and Elena's training would take place far from the city where Marcus was stationed. "I want you to keep this," Elena said, pressing the silver locket into Marcus's hands. "Not as a reminder of the princess I used to be, but as a promise from the woman I have become. Whatever happens next, whatever roles we end up playing in this war, remember that we found each other again when everything seemed lost." Marcus closed his fingers around the locket and felt its familiar weight against his palm. "I will not forget," he promised. "And when this war is over, when we have won or lost or simply survived, I will find you again. That is my promise to you." They embraced briefly, holding each other with the desperate intensity of people who knew that time was running out. Elena memorized the feeling of Marcus's arms around her, the sound of his heartbeat against her ear, the familiar scent that brought back memories of safer times in the palace garden. Anna cleared her throat softly, reminding them that dawn was breaking and they needed to move quickly. Marcus would need to appear at his regular duties before reporting for questioning, while Elena needed to reach the resistance safe house before the city became busy with morning traffic. Elena followed Anna out of the safe house and into the narrow alleys that would take them to the edge of the city. She did not look back at Marcus, knowing that doing so would make their separation even more difficult. Instead, she focused on the path ahead and tried to prepare herself mentally for whatever challenges the resistance training would present. Marcus waited until Elena and Anna had disappeared into the morning shadows before leaving the safe house himself. He walked through the familiar streets toward the military headquarters, carrying false intelligence that might save his life and Elena's freedom. Each step took him further from the woman he loved and deeper into a deception that could destroy everything if it was discovered. The sunrise painted the city in shades of gold and red, but neither Elena nor Marcus noticed the beauty of the morning. They were both focused on the dangerous games they would need to play in order to survive another day in a war that had already taken too much from them. As Marcus approached the imposing building that housed the military command, he straightened his shoulders and assumed the confident posture of a successful officer. In a few hours, he would either be celebrating his cleverness or facing charges of treason. There was no middle ground left for any of them. Elena felt the city fall away behind her as Anna led her toward the mountains and an uncertain future with the resistance. She had spent 2 years learning to survive as Elena Vasiliev, the nurse. Now she would need to discover who she could become as something more than a survivor, but less than a princess. The crowd that had watched her humiliation the day before was still sleeping, unaware that the woman they had seen stripped and shackled was now free and preparing to fight back against the forces that had brought their country to its knees. When they woke up, they would hear stories about the general's brilliant intelligence coup and the valuable prisoner who had provided information about resistance activities. They would never know that they had witnessed the moment when a lost princess chose to become a revolutionary instead. 6 months later, General Marcus Corvus stood in his office reading intelligence reports from across the occupied territories. His deception had worked better than anyone had dared to hope. The false information he had provided about resistance activities had not only satisfied his superiors, but had earned him a promotion and increased responsibilities. He was now in charge of counterintelligence operations for the entire southern region. The irony of his situation was not lost on Marcus. Every day he received genuine intelligence about resistance activities, and every day he found ways to delay or misdirect the military response just enough to give the resistance fighters time to escape or relocate. His position allowed him to protect the very people he was supposed to be hunting while maintaining his cover as a loyal officer of the occupying government. The false intelligence that Anna had provided had led to several spectacular military operations that appeared successful on the surface, but actually accomplished nothing of strategic value. Abandoned buildings were raided with great fanfare, yielding weapons and documents that seemed important but were actually planted evidence. Arrests were made, but the prisoners were low-level operatives who had volunteered to be captured as part of the deception. Marcus's superiors were impressed by his results and never questioned the methods he used to achieve them. His reputation as an effective intelligence officer grew with each apparent success, giving him even more freedom to operate without close supervision. The more successful he appeared to be, the more latitude he was given to pursue his investigations in his own way. Elena had spent those same 6 months in the mountain hideout, learning skills she had never imagined needing as a princess. The resistance had taught her to handle weapons, to move silently through hostile territory, to communicate using codes and signals, and to think strategically about military operations. She discovered that she had a natural talent for planning and organization that served her well in her new role. But the resistance had not pressured her to become a public figurehead as she had initially feared. Instead, they had recognized her intelligence and practical abilities, putting her to work on logistics and coordination rather than symbolic appearances. Elena found herself managing supply networks, planning escape routes, and organizing safe houses throughout the region. The work was demanding and dangerous, but it was also deeply satisfying. Elena could see the direct results of her efforts in the lives that were saved and the successful operations that she helped coordinate. She was no longer just a nurse treating individual patients. She was helping to heal the systematic wounds that war had inflicted on her entire country. Anna Kozlov had become Elena's mentor and closest friend in the resistance. The older woman had extensive experience in underground operations and understood the psychological challenges of living with false identities and constant danger. She helped Elena develop the mental discipline needed to compartmentalize her emotions and focus on objectives rather than personal fears. The resistance network had grown significantly since Elena joined them. Word of Princess Katerina's survival had spread through underground channels, inspiring people who had given up hope after the fall of the royal government. But Elena insisted that her true identity remain a closely guarded secret, known only to the top leadership of the resistance movement. Instead of using her royal status for inspiration, Elena preferred to let her actions speak for themselves. The successful operations she planned and the lives she saved created their own form of credibility. People began to speak of a mysterious resistance leader known only as the Nurse, who seemed to appear wherever help was needed most. The resistance had developed an extensive intelligence network of its own, and Elena learned that Marcus was using his position to protect resistance operations. The knowledge that he was safe and working toward the same goals provided enormous comfort during the difficult months of training and adjustment to her new life. But Elena also understood that Marcus was taking enormous risks every day. One mistake, one suspicious superior, one piece of evidence that did not fit his cover story could expose him as a traitor. The punishment for military officers who betrayed the occupying government was always execution, usually preceded by torture designed to extract information about accomplices and resistance contacts. The turning point came when Elena received intelligence about a planned military operation that would target the hospital where she had worked as a nurse. The occupying government had become suspicious of the medical facility because too many resistance fighters seemed to disappear after receiving treatment there. They planned to raid the hospital and arrest everyone associated with it. Elena knew that dozens of innocent people would be caught up in the raid, including doctors and nurses who had no connection to the resistance, but whose only crime was providing medical care to anyone who needed it. She also knew that many of the patients currently in the hospital were civilians who would die if their treatment was interrupted. The decision to intervene, personally, was not difficult for Elena. She could not stand by and watch helpless people suffer when she had the skills and resources to prevent it. But the operation would require her to return to the city where she might be recognized, and it would mean abandoning the relative safety of the mountain hideout. Anna tried to dissuade Elena from taking such a risk, pointing out that her value to the resistance was too great to risk on a single operation. But Elena was determined to act, with or without official approval from the resistance leadership. The people at the hospital had been her friends and colleagues. She would not abandon them to save herself. The plan Elena developed was complex, but achievable with the resources the resistance could provide. She would infiltrate the city before the planned raid and organize an evacuation of the most vulnerable patients and staff members. At the same time, the resistance would stage diversionary attacks in other parts of the city to draw military resources away from the hospital. Marcus learned about the planned raid through his official channels and immediately began working to delay or disrupt it. But his ability to interfere was limited by the need to maintain his cover. Too obvious an attempt to prevent the operation would expose him as a resistance sympathizer. He could only make subtle changes that might buy Elena and her team a few extra hours. The night before the raid, Elena led a small team of resistance fighters into the city through the same tunnel system she had used to escape 2 years earlier. Moving through the familiar streets felt like returning to a previous life, but Elena found that she was no longer the frightened fugitive who had once hidden in those shadows. She was now a skilled operative with a clear mission and the confidence to carry it out. The evacuation proceeded smoothly at first. Elena and her team worked quickly to move patients who could be safely transported to secure locations outside the city. Medical supplies and equipment were also removed, ensuring that the hospital's capacity could be rebuilt elsewhere if necessary. The staff members who were at greatest risk were given new identities and escape routes. But as dawn approached, Elena realized that they would not be able to evacuate everyone before the raid began. Several critically ill patients could not be moved without risking their lives, and some of the staff members refused to abandon their posts. Elena faced the terrible choice of leaving vulnerable people behind or staying to protect them, and risking capture herself. The decision was made easier when Elena recognized one of the patients who could not be moved. It was the young soldier whose life she had saved with stolen medical supplies, the same soldier who had watched her near execution in the town square. He had been wounded again in a recent battle and was unconscious with a severe head injury. Elena could not abandon the soldier whose grateful face had given her strength during her darkest moment. She sent her team away with the evacuated patients and remained in the hospital with a small group of volunteers to care for those who could not be moved. They would do whatever was necessary to protect their patients, even if it meant facing the military raid directly. The raid began at sunrise, just as Elena had expected. Military vehicles surrounded the hospital while soldiers moved systematically through the building, searching for evidence of resistance connections. Elena had prepared for this possibility by creating false medical records and hiding any supplies that might seem suspicious. When the soldiers reached the ward where Elena was working, she was dressed in a nurse's uniform and caring for patients with the same dedication she had shown before her arrest. She had darkened her hair and changed her appearance enough to avoid immediate recognition, but she knew that closer inspection might expose her true identity. The officer leading the search was Captain Dmitry Volkov, an ambitious young man who hoped to advance his career by uncovering resistance activities. He questioned each staff member aggressively, looking for any sign of deception or nervous behavior. When he reached Elena, his questions became more pointed and detailed. Elena answered each question calmly, using the cover story she had prepared. She was a new nurse who had been hired recently to replace staff members who had fled the city. Her false papers were perfect, created by the same forgers who had given her the Elena Vasilyev identity years earlier. But Captain Volkov seemed suspicious despite the quality of her documentation. The interrogation was interrupted when one of the patients began having a medical emergency. Elena immediately moved to provide care, her actions completely natural and professional. Her skill and knowledge were clearly genuine, supporting her cover story as an experienced nurse. Captain Volkov watched her work, his suspicions gradually fading as he observed her competent medical care. The crisis passed, and the patient stabilized under Elena's care. Captain Volkov completed his search of the hospital without finding any evidence of resistance activities. The evacuation had been too thorough, and Elena's presence as an apparently legitimate staff member added credibility to the hospital's claim of political neutrality. As the military forces prepared to leave, Elena noticed a familiar figure among the officers. General Marcus Corvus had arrived to inspect the results of the raid personally. Their eyes met across the hospital ward, and Elena saw recognition and relief in Marcus's face. He had been terrified that she would be captured or killed during the operation. Marcus managed to approach Elena privately while his staff was completing their documentation of the raid results. They had only a few moments to speak, but it was enough to confirm that both of them were safe and still committed to their dangerous work on behalf of the resistance. "The war is turning," Marcus whispered as he pretended to review medical charts. "The occupying forces are stretched too thin to maintain control much longer. The resistance is growing stronger every day, and public support is shifting. This cannot continue for more than another year." Elena nodded, understanding the larger strategic picture that Marcus's position allowed him to see. "When it ends, we will both have difficult choices to make about who we want to become next." Marcus touched her hand briefly, a gesture that could have been mistaken for a casual professional interaction by anyone watching. "I know who I want to become," he said quietly. "The question is whether you will still have room in your life for a former general when you no longer need to be a former princess." Before Elena could respond, Marcus was called away by his aide. The raid was officially concluded, and the military forces departed the hospital as quickly as they had arrived. Elena watched from a window as Marcus's vehicle disappeared down the street, carrying him back to his double life as a resistance operative disguised as an enemy officer. The hospital resumed its normal operations, though with reduced staff and resources due to the previous night's evacuation. Elena remained for several more days, helping to stabilize the situation and ensure that patient care could continue. When she finally returned to the mountain hideout, she brought with her several new volunteers who wanted to join the resistance. Marcus had been correct about the war's trajectory. Over the following months, the resistance grew bolder and more effective while the occupying forces became increasingly desperate and brutal. Public opinion turned decisively against the occupying government as their policies became more oppressive in response to growing opposition. The end came sooner than anyone had expected. A popular uprising in the capital city overwhelmed the remaining occupation forces, while resistance activities in the countryside cut off supply lines and communications. The occupying government collapsed within weeks, leaving behind a power vacuum that needed to be filled by legitimate leadership. Elena faced enormous pressure to reveal her identity and claim her rightful position as the head of a restored royal government. But she had learned too much about leadership during her time with the resistance to accept a role based solely on bloodline rather than ability. She agreed to serve as a transitional leader only until proper elections could be organized. Marcus resigned his military commission and briefly considered leaving the country to start a new life somewhere far from the memories of war and deception. But Elena convinced him to stay and help rebuild the institutions that would govern the restored kingdom. His experience and integrity made him an ideal candidate for leading the reformed military forces. 1 year after the crowd had watched Elena being stripped on the platform in the town square, she and Marcus returned to that same square for a very different kind of public gathering. Elena was there to formally transfer power to the newly elected government, fulfilling her promise to serve only as long as necessary to restore democratic institutions. Marcus was there in civilian clothes, no longer a general, but not yet sure what he would become next. The crowd was friendly this time, filled with people who had benefited from the resistance's work and the restoration of legitimate government. But Elena felt more nervous than she had during any of her dangerous operations with the resistance. After the ceremony, Elena and Marcus walked together through the city they had helped to liberate. The streets were busy with normal civilian life. Markets operating freely, children playing without fear, people going about their daily business without the constant presence of military patrols. It was the kind of ordinary peace that they had fought to restore. They stopped at a small restaurant that had reopened since the war's end and ordered a simple meal together. For the first time in years, they could speak freely without fear of being overheard or misunderstood. The constant tension of maintaining false identities and hidden loyalties had finally been lifted. "I've been thinking about your question," Elena said as they shared their meal, "about whether I would have room in my life for a former general. The answer is yes, but not because of what either of us used to be, because of who we became when everything else was taken away." Marcus smiled, the same expression Elena remembered from their conversations in the palace garden years earlier. "And what did we become?" Elena considered the question seriously, thinking about everything they had experienced and learned during the war years. "We became people who are willing to sacrifice personal comfort for principles that matter. People who understand that true strength comes from helping others rather than commanding them. People who have learned that love is not about possession, but about supporting each other's growth into whoever we choose to become." The crowd in the town square had dispersed by the time Elena and Marcus finished their meal and walked back to see the platform where everything had changed 6 months earlier. The wooden structure had been dismantled, leaving only the cobblestones where hundreds of people had once gathered to witness what they thought would be a routine punishment. Elena touched the spot where the iron rings had held her arms above her head, remembering the fear and despair she had felt at that moment. But she also remembered the moment when everything had changed, when Marcus had recognized the mark on her back and chosen to risk everything to save her. "Do you think it was fate that brought us back together?" Marcus asked, following her thoughts as he often could. Elena shook her head. "It was choice. Your choice to act with compassion instead of following orders blindly. My choice to trust you despite the risks. Both of our choices to keep fighting for something better even when victory seemed impossible. Fate just gave us the opportunity to choose." As the sun set over the restored city, Elena and Marcus walked home together to the simple house they had bought near the hospital where Elena had returned to work as a nurse. She had kept her promise to remain Elena rather than reverting to Princess Katerina, finding more satisfaction in healing individual patients than in wielding political power. Marcus had started a school for military veterans, helping former soldiers from both sides of the conflict learn civilian skills and adjust to peacetime life. His understanding of the psychological costs of war made him uniquely qualified to help others process their experiences and find new purposes. They had both discovered that the most important battles are often fought in ordinary moments rather than dramatic confrontations. The crowd that had watched Elena's humiliation could never have imagined that they were witnessing the beginning of a love story that would help restore their entire kingdom to freedom and peace. The mark on Elena's back remained unchanged, a crescent moon that had once been a closely guarded royal secret. But it no longer mattered who knew about it or what it represented. Elena had proven that her true identity came from her actions and choices rather than any birthmark or bloodline. Years later, when people told stories about the war and its aftermath, they would remember the mysterious resistance leader known as the Nurse and the brilliant general who had helped liberate their country. Few would ever connect those legendary figures to the quiet couple who ran a medical clinic and a veteran school in the restored capital. Elena and Marcus preferred it that way. They had learned that the most meaningful victories are often the ones that no crowd witnesses, the daily choices to help others and support each other that gradually transform the world one person at a time. Their love had survived war and deception and revolution, proving that some things are strong enough to endure any test that fate or choice can devise.